Chicago, January. The cold sliced like a thin, silent blade. Ethan Miller stepped off the bus at Union Station with only a backpack, a cheap coat that didn't block the wind, and a phone with 12% battery. He had never seen snow fall like that. Soft, spirals, almost as if the sky felt compassion. He came from Alabama, where the word faggot was still thrown like a rock. At 22, after being beaten outside a party and ignored by his own family, he decided the big city, despite its dangers, was his only shot at starting over. Chicago felt too big, too cold, too unknown, but it was also the only place where no one knew his past. He didn't have an elaborate plan, just needed a room, a job, any job, and a little peace. First shelter downtown, Ethan went straight to an LGBTQIA+ shelter he found on Reddit. It was in an old building near Logan Square, with peeling walls but a warm atmosphere. A volunteer named Marsha welcomed him with a tired smile and alert eyes. "What's your full name?" she asked, typing into a second-hand laptop. "Ethan James." "Miller. Got any documents?" "Yes, I can work. Just don't have a place to stay." "You can stay here up to 3 weeks. Then we try to find something. This city's not easy, but getting here is already a lot." Ethan nodded. That night, lying on a sagging bed, he heard the city's sounds for the first time. Distant horns, sirens, and a different kind of silence. Dense, urban. Not a countryside quiet, but one of survival. An unexpected message. 3 days later, Marsha pulled Ethan aside. "There's a guy offering a room in Humboldt Park. Want to go meet him?" It was the first time someone offered him something without asking for anything in return. Ethan hesitated, but said yes. That's how he met Daniel. The apartment. Daniel Reyes opened the door with a shy smile. Deep brown eyes, light brown skin, and a grey hoodie with a Studio Ghibli print. Ethan quickly noticed he didn't speak. Marsha explained, "Daniel is deaf. He communicates through writing, lip reading, and ASL, but he's chill, super respectful, artist." The apartment smelled of paint and old coffee, hand-drawn illustrations on the walls, diverse bodies, vibrant colours, intense gazes. The kitchen was narrow but functional. The living room couch was worn. The room Ethan would stay in was simple but clean. Daniel handed him a notepad and pen. He wrote, "Welcome. This is a safe place." For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like crying. Not from fear, but from relief. First night. That night, Ethan didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, listening to Daniel's quiet steps, or in the hallway. He felt out of place, yes, but for the first time he wasn't ashamed of existing. Before closing his eyes, he wrote something and left it on the kitchen table. "Thank you for taking me in. I'm not great at living with people, but I'll try." The next morning it was answered in bold letters, "Trying together is enough." The following days were filled with a comfortable silence. Not the tense kind that came with rejection, shame, or fear. Ethan slowly realized that Daniel's silence was a different kind of language. There was no rush, no judgment, no unnecessary noise. Their communication grew through glances, improvised gestures, and sticky notes scattered around the apartment. In the first week alone, Ethan began to understand Daniel's world. The apartment walls were covered with hand-drawn illustrations, bodies, sketched with precision, people in everyday moments, most with unique traits, scars, hearing aids, ambiguous expressions. It was a world Ethan had never known, gentle, firm, deep. Daniel woke up early, brewed strong coffee, wore headphones only to muffle the world, an old habit, he explained in writing, and drew for hours in the makeshift studio in the living room. Ethan, on the other hand, was still searching for direction. He had printed resumes, but lacked the courage to go out. The city still intimidated him. On Wednesday, while Daniel was sketching a couple hugging on the subway, Ethan finally opened. "Up, can I tell you something?" he asked, hesitant. Daniel looked up, gave a gentle smile, and handed him the notebook. "Of course. Write it if you want. Ethan sat on the rug, took a breath, and wrote in bold letters. I was beaten in Alabama. After a party. My dad said, I should have been hit harder. My mum just cried. I never tried to go back. Daniel read it, set the notebook down, and wrote back. I was 15 when I got pushed down the stairs at school, burst my eardrum, never heard from my left ear again. Then came the silence. But not this kind. They looked at each other for a moment. No tears, just the exchange of raw truths, as if their pain had finally found someone who wouldn't flinch. The first outing on Friday, Daniel suggested they go out. He pulled out his phone and typed, There's a queer art exhibit in Pilsen. Want to go? Ethan hesitated. He still felt awkward in public spaces, but something about Daniel made him feel safe. He agreed. They dressed well, took the train, and headed to the city's Latino neighborhood. The gallery was small, warmly lit, with ambient music. Artwork after artwork, Ethan saw pieces of himself. Disfigured faces, vibrant colors, androgynous figures. He felt tight in the chest, but also an intense desire to keep walking. Daniel watched him curiously, like someone trying to read a book in another language. He grabbed a curator's business card and handed it to Ethan with a smile. Your art too, Ethan blushed. He was getting used to that kind of silent compliment. Words didn't need sound to be true. A new routine over time, Ethan started walking around the neighborhood. He found a laundromat where he could print resumes for 10 cents, an LGBTQ+ cafe called Moonbeam, and a night market near the park. He began leaving the house every morning with small goals: hand out 2 resumes, talk to 1 new person, smile at least once. Daniel kept his monastic rhythm. When not drawing, he cooked simple meals: tacos, soups, lentils with rice. He never demanded anything, but always set aside a portion for Ethan. One Monday night, Ethan came home and saw a new drawing on the wall. It was him, from behind, looking out the window. His posture slightly hunched, hands in his pockets, and, in the background, snow-covered Chicago. Next to it, Daniel had written with a brush, "Those who watch the world are still part of it." Ethan leaned on the wall and smiled for the first time without guilt. An unexpected gift. That same night, Daniel left a box on Ethan's bed. Inside was a hard-covered white notebook with his name hand-lettered on it, Ethan Miller, words that don't scream. It was a journal, but not just any journal. It was divided into sections with prompts. What are you most afraid of today? What was the last hug you felt? If you could go back, what would you say to your 15-year-old self? Ethan spent hours filling its pages, crying silently. In the end, he wrote something he still couldn't say out loud. Maybe I deserve to be happy. Chicago's winter didn't soften. It pressed against windows, froze the sidewalks, and settled deep into people's routines like an extra weight. But inside Daniel's apartment, a quiet shift was taking place. Ethan had started to speak more, not with words necessarily, but through his choices. He no longer avoided the mirror. He made his bed every morning. He even began washing the dishes without being asked. Daniel noticed each of these changes. He didn't comment directly. Not in writing, not in signs. Instead, he'd draw. On one Wednesday morning, Ethan found a new sketch on the fridge. A boy standing at a sink, water running, a faint smile on his face. Above it, written with delicate brushstrokes, "Growth makes no sound." That morning, Ethan smiled before his coffee. The sound of fear it wasn't all peace. One night, a neighbor across the hallway shouted something through the thin apartment walls. Angry, aggressive. Ethan froze. He felt the words before he processed them. Something about freaks and welfare parasites. His heart jumped. He sat on the floor, legs drawn to his chest. Daniel came out of his room when he noticed the shift in energy. He didn't hear the slurs, but he saw Ethan's posture. He knelt down and placed a hand on his shoulder. Ethan looked up, and for a second thought of pretending he was fine, but he couldn't. "I get scared when people yell," Ethan whispered. "Even if it's not at me." Daniel nodded, then stood and returned with a pen and paper. He scribbled, fast. "Me too. I can't hear the words, but I feel the vibrations. Hate has a weight." They sat together for a long while, in silence. A job, or something like it. A week later, Ethan received a call. A local bookstore, small, independent, queer-owned, needed someone to organize inventory and clean up after hours. No customer service, no phones, just books and order. Marlon from the cafe had passed along his resume. Ethan was stunned. He wasn't sure he could do it. Not yet. But Daniel encouraged him with a note. "Your silence doesn't mean you can't take space." So he went. The place was warm, full of creaky wooden floors and books piled everywhere. The owner, Jay, was non-binary and in their 40s, with long braids and a wicked sense of humor. They handed Ethan a key and said, "Mess it up and we'll fix it together." For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt trusted. A whisper of the past one afternoon at work, while dusting a high shelf, Ethan found a worn paperback with the title, Letters Never Sent. It was a collection of unsent letters from queer people to their families, friends, past selves. He opened to a random page. "Dear Dad, I am still the same kid who laughed at your dumb jokes. The same one who stayed quiet because he thought it was love. I didn't change. You closed your eyes." Ethan sat on the floor and read for an hour. Each letter felt like his, a mirror and a wound. He took the book home. That night, he wrote his own letter inside the journal Daniel had given him. "Dear me, you are not disgusting. You never were." What they said was a mirror of their fear, not your truth. He left the journal open on the table. Daniel read it in the morning and drew a heart next to it. A city of invisible people. Winter in Chicago was full of ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, but real ones. The unhoused, the silenced, the avoided. On their walks together, Ethan began to notice how many people looked through Daniel. Not at him, through him. As if silence made someone vanish. Once, at a corner shop, the cashier refused to face Daniel when he gestured. Instead, he looked at Ethan. "He doesn't talk," the man said, shrugging. "Kinda creepy." Ethan didn't flinch. "He's right here," he said. "You can talk to him." The man blinked, then muttered something, and walked away. Daniel smiled later, as they walked out. He wrote on his phone, "Thank you for not translating me." "Just for standing there," Ethan replied, honestly. "You've been doing that for me, since day one." A step on stage. The open mic night arrived. The Moonbeam Cafe was packed. The scent of coffee, cinnamon, and snow-damp coats filled the air. Daniel sat near the front with his sketchbook in hand. Marlon adjusted the mic and called. Ethan up, grinning. "Next up," a soft voice with strong words. "Ethan." He walked up like his legs didn't belong to him. His hands shook. He opened his notebook and read. "I used to think silence was weakness, that being soft was surrender, that I had to be louder to be safe. But then I met someone who didn't shout, and he taught me that quiet can be brave." The crowd clapped, not loudly, but sincerely. Ethan looked at Daniel. Daniel tapped his chest, then pointed at him. Proud. That night they walked home with no words. None were needed. Chicago thawed slowly, like someone learning to trust again. The sharp sting of January softened into the damp grey of February. Snow no longer blanketed the sidewalks, but lingered in patches, like thoughts Ethan couldn't quite shake. Routine had settled in. Ethan worked nights at the bookstore, spent his mornings journaling or walking, and shared quiet meals with Daniel. There was rhythm now. A heartbeat, not loud, but steady. Yet the things we carry have a way of resurfacing, even when buried deep. The suitcase. One afternoon, Daniel came home to find Ethan sitting in the living room with a small, worn-out suitcase on his lap. The same one he'd brought from Alabama. He hadn't opened it since his first night in Chicago. "I think it's time," Ethan said. Daniel didn't ask questions. He simply nodded, sat nearby, and waited. Ethan unzipped the case slowly, as if unlocking a memory. Inside were a few folded clothes, a torn journal, a photograph of Ethan at 16, smiling awkwardly, standing between his parents. His father's hand gripped his shoulder too tightly. His mother looked away from the camera. He placed the photo on the table. Daniel looked at it for a long time, then wrote, "That smile isn't real." Ethan nodded. "I know." Then he tore the photo in half, right between his parents, and tossed it into the trash. Daniel didn't flinch. He just reached out and handed Ethan his sketchbook. "Draw what comes after." Ethan stared at the blank page for a while, then picked up a pencil. He drew himself, not as he was, but as he wanted to be, standing alone, hands open, with Chicago's skyline behind him and Daniel beside him, both of them facing forward. He wasn't an artist, but the lines were honest. A visit from the past. The next day, Ethan received a message from an unknown number. "Ethan, it's Mom. I heard you're in Chicago. Can we talk?" He stared at the screen for a long time. His breath shortened. His fingers trembled. He locked the phone and set it face down on the table. Daniel noticed. "Everything okay?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Then, quietly, "My mum. She wants to talk." Daniel waited. "I don't know if I want to," Ethan added. "I'm afraid it'll break something I've only just started to build." Daniel wrote, "You don't owe anyone your healing, but if you want to talk, I'll be there." Later, that night, Ethan wrote a letter instead of replying. It wasn't angry, just honest. "You left me behind, but I didn't stay. I'm learning to breathe again. If you want to know who I am now, you'll need to meet me here, in the present, not the past." He didn't send it. He folded it into the back of his journal. Some truths weren't meant for others, only for ourselves. The weight of silence. Despite their growing bond, Ethan and Daniel hadn't yet talked about one thing: love. They didn't kiss. They didn't touch much, just brief brushes of fingers when passing a mug, or tired shoulders leaning on the couch. But it was there, in the silences. In the way Daniel waited for Ethan to finish writing before he responded. In the way Ethan watched Daniel's sketch as if memorizing every movement. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Ethan asked, "Have you ever been in love?" Daniel looked surprised by the question. He thought for a long time, then wrote, "Once. A long time ago. He was kind, but he wanted me to be louder than I am." Ethan nodded. "I think I've been in almost love, the kind that makes you smaller just to stay." They didn't say anything else that night. But when Daniel placed a second pillow on the couch before bed, Ethan smiled. It meant, "You're allowed to stay here. Fully." A name. A choice. 2 days later, Ethan went to the DMV. His ID still said Alabama. It still had the name he never felt connected to. The photo, taken at 17, showed someone with flat eyes and a clenched jaw. He stood in line for an hour. When it was his turn, he filled out the change of address form, then hesitated. The clerk, a black woman in her 50s, looked at him kindly. "You want to change anything else, baby?" He swallowed hard. "Yes, I want to change my middle name." "To what?" He smiled. "Daniel," the woman smiled back. "That's a good name." Ethan left the DMV with a small piece of paper and a quiet fire in his chest. That night, he showed Daniel. Daniel read it, then simply wrote, "Now we carry each other." By early March, the snow had melted into slush, and the city felt in between, neither cold nor warm, neither bleak nor blooming. Chicago was waking up slowly, just like Ethan. With a month of bookstore work behind him, he no longer flinched when strangers greeted him. He even started organizing poetry nights once a week at Jay's suggestion. It was a quiet kind of leadership. He lit the candles, rearranged the chairs, and made sure the mic worked. Daniel attended every time. He never clapped loudly, but his presence was a kind of applause, a space that holds you. The apartment, once a temporary shelter, had become home. Ethan began calling it ours when talking to people, our kitchen, our street. Daniel never corrected him. One Saturday morning, as they folded laundry together in companionable silence, Ethan glanced at Daniel and asked, "Do you ever feel like it's okay to stop surviving?" Daniel looked up, surprised. He wrote, "Only in rooms like this one, with people like you." Ethan swallowed a sudden knot in his throat. They kept folding shirts. The safe word. That week, something unexpected happened. While walking back from Moonbeam Cafe, a man passed by and brushed against Ethan's shoulder hard, not enough to cause pain, but enough to bring back the memory of fists. Ethan froze. His body locked down before his mind could explain why. Daniel noticed instantly. He stepped in front of Ethan, gently placed a hand on his chest, and signed, something Ethan didn't understand. Later at home, Daniel wrote, "We should have a word, something you can say or sign if you need space. Safety, no questions asked." Ethan thought for a moment. "Glass," he said. Daniel tilted his head, curious. "It's breakable, but it also reflects. That's what I feel like sometimes." Daniel nodded, then made the ASL sign for glass and taught it to Ethan. From that day on, it became their unspoken agreement. If Ethan whispered or signed glass, Daniel would stop, step back, and wait. That kind of safety, Ethan realized, was rare and sacred. A memory reclaimed midway through the month, Ethan passed a thrift store on his way to work. In the window was an old Polaroid camera, yellowing with age, with a small handwritten sign. "Still works. $5. He bought it. That night, he snapped their first photo together. Not a posed one. Just Daniel sitting on the floor, sketchbook in hand, one sock missing, laughing silently. Ethan pinned it to the fridge. Then he reached into his journal and pulled out the torn photo from Alabama, the one he'd saved despite everything. He looked at it for a long time, then took a lighter and burned the remaining piece. Daniel didn't ask. He just added a new drawing beside the Polaroid on the fridge. Two silhouettes sitting side by side on a rooftop, watching the stars. No words. Just presence. A night of firsts one Friday evening, they stayed up late, drinking mint tea and listening to the sounds of the city through a cracked window. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" Ethan asked. Daniel wrote, "If they were different, I wouldn't be here, and you wouldn't either." Ethan let that sit between them. Then, for the first time, he reached for Daniel's hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, just fingers finding fingers, no tension, no fear. Daniel didn't pull away. Instead, he gently squeezed. They fell asleep like that, seated on the couch, the lamp still on, the tea gone cold. Outside, Chicago hummed. Inside, something unspoken had begun. Spring arrived in Chicago slowly, like someone unsure they were welcome. Patches of green started pushing through cracks in the pavement. Trees showed timid buds, and in Ethan, something else began to bloom too. Restlessness. He had carved out safety, daily rituals, quiet evenings, soft routines with Daniel. But now a voice inside him whispered, "What comes next?" The bookstore gave him stability. The apartment gave him peace. Daniel gave him presence. But something still pulsed under the skin, an ache not of pain, but of becoming. A stranger's story. One Tuesday evening, after poetry night, Ethan lingered, behind to help Jay stack chairs. The room was nearly empty when a woman approached, mid-30s, sharp eyes, faded denim jacket. She'd been in the back all night, scribbling in a notebook but never reading aloud. "I liked your piece," she said, voice low but steady. "You talk like someone who's survived a storm and still listens for rain." Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He gave a small smile. "I used to write too," she continued. "Stopped when it felt like I was writing only for the ghosts. But maybe that's okay." She didn't give her name, just walked out, notebook in hand. That night, Ethan stared at the ceiling for hours. Who did he write for? Who was he now that survival wasn't the only goal? Tracing pain. A few days later, Ethan noticed Daniel drawing something he tried to hide. It wasn't one of his usual expressive sketches. It was a body, his own possibly, marked with lines, bruises, scars. There was a heaviness in it, a truth. Ethan waited until Daniel left the room, then he looked again. The figure in the drawing wasn't just wounded, it was learning to touch itself again, gently, almost with reverence. When Daniel came back, Ethan didn't speak. He sat beside him and simply wrote, "What helped you forgive? Your own body?" Daniel paused, then slowly wrote, "Giving it softness, letting others see it without shame, drawing it over and over until it belonged to me again." Ethan nodded, eyes misty. Later that night, he undressed with the lights on for the first time since moving in. Daniel didn't say anything, but his eyes never left Ethan, and they didn't look away in pity. They looked with recognition. Letters. On Skin that weekend, Ethan took Daniel to a tattoo shop in Logan Square. "I want something permanent," he said. Daniel raised his eyebrows. "I don't want to erase the past," Ethan continued. "I want to carry it differently." He chose a small line of text, right over his heart, in lowercase typewriter font, "Still here." Daniel held his hand the whole time. The artist, quiet, queer, and gentle, nodded once when he finished. No big speech, just a clean cloth and a smile. That said, "I get it." That night, Ethan stood shirtless in the mirror and traced the words with his fingers. It didn't feel like a rebellion. It felt like a homecoming, a different kind of fear. One night, Ethan woke in a panic, sweat-soaked, shaking, the remnants of a nightmare clinging to his skin like static. Daniel was already there, rubbing slow circles on his back. Ethan gasped. "I dreamed I was back home, in that church basement. They were trying to fix me. My father said, he said I wasn't human." Daniel didn't speak. He just pulled Ethan closer. They sat like that until sunrise. Then Daniel got up, brought 2 mugs of tea, and sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table. He wrote, "Your past doesn't get to name you anymore." Ethan nodded, but deep down, he still feared it would try. Chicago bloomed with hesitation. Trees stretched cautiously into April air, and the city, so often grey, dared to wear colour again. Sidewalk cafes reopened. Strangers lingered on benches. People laughed in the streets. Ethan wasn't sure how to feel about it. The world was louder now, brighter, more alive, and though part of him longed to match that energy, another part wasn't ready. He had spent so long in survival mode, in silence, in safety. What did it mean to step into the light? The job offer. One afternoon, Jay pulled Ethan aside at the bookstore. They handed him a business card with gold lettering and a soft smile. "Friend of mine runs an arts non-profit. They're looking for someone to coordinate community events, poetry readings, gallery nights, stuff like that. I think you'd be good." Ethan blinked. "Me?" Jay nodded. "You hold space better than most people I know. That's rare." It wasn't a promotion. It wasn't even full-time. But it was visible. People would see him, count on him, expect things. He pocketed the card and said he'd think about it. That night, he told Daniel. Daniel listened quietly, then wrote, "Do you want it? Not just can you do it, but do you want to?" Ethan stared at the ceiling for a long time that night. He wanted to be more than safe, but he didn't know if he could handle the weight that came with being seen. Flashback. Later that week, Ethan passed by a church in Humboldt Park. It wasn't his church, but it looked enough like the one from home to freeze him on the spot. Red bricks, white trim, a faded banner that read, "Grace heals all." He didn't go inside. He didn't have to. The memory came anyway. The basement, the folding chairs, the smell of cheap coffee and shame. A man with a clipboard saying, "There's still hope for boys like you." A circle of strangers praying with hands too tight. The words unclean, unnatural, temptation, sin. He ran all the way home. Daniel opened the door and knew instantly Ethan couldn't speak. So Daniel didn't ask. He just sat with him, back against the couch, shoulder to shoulder, silent. The light doesn't always heal. Sometimes it blinds. Choosing visibility. 3 days later, Ethan returned to the bookstore and found Jay restocking the LGBTQ+ section. "I want to try," he said, voice small but steady. Jay smiled. "They'll be lucky to have you." That night, Ethan and Daniel stayed up late, reorganizing his resume, drafting emails. Daniel designed a simple but elegant logo for Ethan's cover letter. They worked until 1 a.m., fueled by cereal and soft music. It was the most Ethan had laughed in weeks. He sent the application before he could overthink it, and then waited. The fear of becoming. While waiting for a reply, Ethan began to notice a shift in his inner voice. The critical one, the one shaped by sermons and slurs, had grown quieter. Not gone, but no longer in control. He could walk past mirrors without flinching. He could meet new people without lying about who he was. He could wear the clothes he liked, not just the ones that made him invisible. And yet, some nights, the voice came back. It whispered, "You're still too much, or not enough. They'll find out. You'll break everything you've built." Ethan wrote those fears down in his journal. Then he wrote, underneath, "And even if I do fall apart, I know who will sit with me while I rebuild." Daniel found the journal open the next day. He didn't say anything, just hugged Ethan from behind and didn't let go for a while. April stretched toward May with warm wind and distant thunder. Chicago was alive in a way Ethan hadn't seen before. Markets spilling into sidewalks, impromptu jazz shows on corners, children running through water from cracked hydrants. And, for the first time, Ethan felt part of it. He didn't just live in the city, he belonged to it. And then the email came. The offer subject, program coordinator position, offer letter. He stared at the screen, rereading the words. It was real. They wanted him, small salary, flexible hours, and a chance to build something meaningful. He closed his laptop, sat back on the couch, and stared at the ceiling. Daniel walked in, eyebrows raised. Ethan didn't speak. He just smiled, wide and wordless, and held up both hands like he was holding something fragile. Daniel sat beside him and signed, "You're allowed to celebrate." So they did. They ordered delivery from their favorite Venezuelan place, lit candles they never used, and danced, badly, in the kitchen. Ethan hadn't felt that light in years. A knock on the door. 2 days later, just after sunset, someone knocked. Ethan was in the shower. Daniel answered. When Ethan stepped out, towel around his waist, he heard a voice he hadn't heard in over a year. "Ethan?" He froze. His mother stood in the doorway, clutching her purse like it might protect her. I was visiting my cousin in Naperville," she stammered. "I just thought, maybe..." Her voice trailed off. Daniel looked at Ethan, waiting. Ethan didn't speak. His body said everything. Tense shoulders, eyes wide, breath shallow. "I won't." "Stay," she said quickly. I just wanted to see you. See that you're okay. He didn't know how to answer. Daniel stepped back, giving them space. After a long silence, Ethan nodded once. I'm okay, he said. She nodded too. I'm glad. She didn't ask to come in. He didn't invite her. After a minute, she turned and walked away. Daniel closed the door gently behind her. Ethan sank to the floor and cried, not because he was hurt, but because he wasn't. Not anymore. The cost of staying. That night, Daniel made tea and joined Ethan on the floor. They didn't speak for a while. Then Ethan asked, how do you stay soft in a world that keeps trying to harden you? Daniel thought, then wrote, I stay close to people who don't demand that I explain myself to be loved. Ethan nodded. The next morning, he sent the official email accepting the job. Not because he was healed, but because he wanted to stay anyway. By the end of May, Chicago pulsed with life. The lakefront paths were full of joggers and couples, dogs pulling their leashes, kids eating melting popsicles. Trees had fully bloomed, and every corner seemed to hold music, laughter, or the smell of something cooking. It should have been perfect, but healing has its own clock. And Ethan's was ticking in uneven rhythms, a life that's too loud. His new job had picked up momentum fast. What started as a modest community role at the arts nonprofit had turned into a chaotic blur of meetings, artist calls, social media posts, and troubleshooting events with unpredictable turnouts. He was organizing a summer showcase now, with over 20 contributors. He came home late, ate at odd hours, forgot to reply to texts, and left laundry half done. His notebook, once filled daily with thoughts and reflections, sat untouched on his nightstand. Daniel noticed. At first, he stayed quiet. Then he left a note. Are you still in there? Ethan read it, then sat with it in his hands for 15 minutes, unsure what the honest answer was. He wanted to say yes, but parts of him felt elsewhere, like he was being pulled into 10 versions of himself, all running toward approval and none slowing down to breathe. The breaking point, it was a Sunday morning. Daniel had made pancakes, Ethan's favorite. He was setting the table when Ethan, distracted, pacing and talking into his phone about a venue permit, barely noticed. Ethan, Daniel said softly, motioning for his attention. Ethan covered the phone's mic. I can't, not right now, just 5 minutes, okay? Daniel paused, then quietly sat down and ate alone. When Ethan finally ended the call, he found Daniel folding his sketches on the couch, methodical, distant. Are you mad? Ethan asked. Daniel shook his head, but he didn't look up. Ethan sat beside him. I'm trying so hard. This project, this work, it's the first thing that's felt like mine. Daniel nodded, then picked up his notepad and wrote, I know, but I miss you. I miss us. I don't want to compete with your healing. Ethan froze. He hadn't seen it that way. He hadn't realized that in building a new life, he was letting parts of it drift. Quiet parts. Sacred ones. Later that night, he cried in the shower. Not loudly. Just enough to feel the weight loosen. Flashback. On a train. A few days later, while riding the L train to a planning meeting, Ethan saw a boy, maybe 17, sitting alone, hugging a backpack tight to his chest. He wore a hoodie in the heat, sleeves pulled over his hands. His eyes scanned the car with quiet panic. Ethan knew that look. He remembered it. He had been that look. He almost didn't say anything. But when the boy stood up to leave, Ethan gently touched his arm and said, You don't need to fold yourself. So small. Not for them. The boy blinked, eyes wide. Then he nodded and left without saying a word. Ethan sat back and felt something crack open in his chest. An ache that wasn't pain, but memory. He texted Daniel without thinking. "Thank you for never asking me to shrink," Daniel replied. "Thank you for learning to take up space." A return to presence that weekend, they unplugged. No phones, no deadlines, just the two of them. They made soup from scratch, sat on the floor with music playing, and took turns drawing, each other badly in Daniel's sketchbook. Ethan's attempts were terrible, which made Daniel laugh so hard he fell over. It was the kind of laughter Ethan hadn't heard in weeks. Free, warm, unguarded. Later that night, Ethan lit a candle, opened his long-neglected journal, and finally wrote, "I've been sprinting toward a version of myself that doesn't flinch, doesn't pause, doesn't feel too much. But I don't want to be someone who escapes vulnerability. I want to be someone who chooses it, even when it hurts." He left the journal open on the kitchen table. When he woke up the next morning, a small post-it was attached to the page. "You're already that someone. The hard kind of love. They fought again. Not like before. No slammed doors. No retreat. This time, it was about boundaries." Ethan had accepted a weekend event without discussing it. Daniel had hoped they'd finally visit the botanical gardens like they'd planned for months. "I didn't do it to hurt you," Ethan said. "I know," Daniel wrote. "But sometimes, forgetting to include me does hurt." Ethan didn't have a defense, just a realization. Loving someone wasn't just showing up when convenient. It was inviting them into your choices. Not every single one, but the ones that shaped the shared life. So they talked, not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. They made tea, sat close, breathed through the tension. Daniel drew a small square in his notebook, then another beside it. "This is us," he wrote. "Side by side, always learning the edges." Ethan smiled, then added one more square, slightly overlapping. Summer settled over Chicago like a slow exhale. The lake warmed. Street festivals unfolded across neighborhoods. The air was heavy with jasmine and grilled corn, and laughter spilling from open windows. Ethan's world had grown. He had new routines. Early, meetings, long days planning community events, answering emails, mentoring queer teens who reminded him of past versions of himself. He had a drawer full of zines now, some of which featured his writing. His name had appeared in small print on 2 flyers. People knew who he was. But more importantly, he was beginning to know himself. And still, he returned home each night to the same quiet hum. The sound of Daniel sketching in the living room. Soft music from the record player, the low hum of city life through the window. The noise outside no longer overwhelmed him. It grounded him, building without blueprint. One July afternoon, Ethan came home with paint on his hands and sun on his skin. He was helping revitalize a mural in Pilsen, one painted by queer artists, layered with memory and resistance. Daniel was at the kitchen table, surrounded by art supplies and half-finished panels for an upcoming exhibit. He looked up and smiled. Ethan walked over and kissed the top of his head. They didn't need to narrate their days anymore. Sometimes they did, but silence had become part of their language too. Later that night, Ethan opened a drawer and found a folder he hadn't touched in months. Old letters he'd written and never sent. Letters to his parents. Letters to his younger self. Letters to boys he'd loved silently. Letters full of pain and clarity. He took them out, one by one. Then, slowly, fed each into the fireplace. Daniel watched from the couch, said nothing. But when Ethan turned around, Daniel was holding a new journal. The cover read, "Only what you want to carry forward." The invitation, in late July, Ethan received an email from a small queer literary press based in Minneapolis. They had read one of his poems in a zine and wanted to include it in a chapbook called Voices That Stayed. He stared at the screen, blinking. It was just one poem, but it felt like being seen. He printed the email and taped it to the fridge. Daniel added a post-it next to it. "I saw you first." That night, they walked to the lake and watched the fireworks from a pier crowded with strangers. Ethan leaned, his head on Daniel's shoulder. "We should go somewhere," Ethan whispered. "Not to escape, just to celebrate." Daniel nodded. A trip. Something just for them. Not reactive, not healing, just living. They planned it slowly. Cheap flights, a borrowed tent, a weekend in a forest preserve near the Wisconsin border. No reception, no noise, just trees and sky and time. The woods in the forest, Ethan remembered. How to breathe deeper. They hiked for hours without destination, cooked pasta on a camp stove, slept tangled in sleeping bags, telling each other stories in the dark. On the second night, Ethan woke early, before sunrise. He stepped out of the tent barefoot, the ground cold against his skin. The sky was just starting to lighten, and mist hung low across the trees. Daniel followed a few minutes later, wrapped in a blanket, eyes soft with sleep. Ethan turned to him and said simply, "I used to think survival was the same as living." Daniel waited. Ethan exhaled. "But I think we're allowed to want more. Not just peace. Joy. Mess. Noise. Light." Daniel took his hand, then pulled a small tin from his jacket. Inside was a ring, simple, silver, not flashy. Daniel didn't kneel. He didn't need to. He just placed the ring in Ethan's palm, then signed, "Not because I want to bind you, but because I want to walk beside you, wherever this goes." Ethan's eyes welled. Home remade. They returned to Chicago in August. Nothing had changed. And everything had. The city still buzzed, sweaty and electric. Rent was still high. The L was still late. The non-profit was still underfunded. People still stared sometimes, but Ethan no longer felt like he was walking alone, and not just because of Daniel, because of who he'd become. One afternoon, he spoke at a panel about queer resilience. He talked about the cost of silence, about being hurt in God's name, about building something softer anyway. A trans girl in the back row asked him, "Do you think it ever stops hurting?" He didn't lie. He said, "Not always, but it gets quieter, and you get louder, and one day You realize the pain isn't steering anymore. She nodded and smiled. Ethan stepped off the stage into Daniel's arms. The room they built that night, they painted the spare room, not because it needed it, just because they wanted to. They chose a color between green and blue like lake water. They played records, took turns climbing the stepladder, got paint on their faces, laughed until their stomachs hurt. On one wall, Daniel painted a line of poetry in soft white letters. "We built this with light we made ourselves." And beneath it, Ethan added one more word: together.